The morning sun peeked through the windows of Riverside High School as Miss Taylor wheeled herself down the freshly polished hallway. Her heart beat faster with each push of her wheelchair, but her smile stayed firm. This was her first day as an advanced English teacher, and she wasn't going to let anything dim her excitement. "You must be the new teacher," a friendly voice called out. The school secretary, Mrs. Chen, hurried over with a stack of papers and a warm welcome. "Let me show you to your classroom." As they moved through the corridors, students gathered in small groups, their whispers following Miss Taylor like shadows. She caught fragments of their conversations. Is she really teaching advanced English? How will she even write on the board? I heard she's from the city. Miss Taylor had faced these reactions before. As the only black teacher in the school and someone who used a wheelchair, she knew she stood out. But she also knew what she was capable of. She'd graduated top of her class, earned her master's degree, and spent 3 years teaching at one of the most challenging schools in the city. The classroom was spacious, with rows of empty desks facing a large whiteboard. Miss Taylor positioned herself behind her desk, arranging her materials with practiced efficiency. She'd arrived an hour early to make sure everything was perfect. Her laptop was connected to the projector, her lesson plans were ready, and she'd already adjusted the desk height to accommodate her wheelchair. The first bell rang, and students began filing in. Some stopped short at the door, surprise clear on their faces. Others walked in slowly, uncertainty in their steps. A few smiled politely, though their eyes held questions they weren't asking. "Good morning, everyone." Miss Taylor's voice was clear and confident, carrying to every corner of the room. "I'm your new advanced English teacher." She began taking attendance, noting how some students barely mumbled their responses, while others watched her with obvious curiosity. A girl in the back row raised her hand. "Miss, will you be able to handle all the grading and stuff? You know, with your..." She gestured vaguely at the wheelchair. Instead of showing offense, Miss Taylor smiled. "I appreciate your concern," she said, wheeling herself to the student's desk with smooth precision. "But I assure you, I can handle everything this job requires, and then some. Now, who's ready to dive into some fascinating literature?" She pulled up a presentation about their first novel study. The screen displayed a quote from James Baldwin: "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." As Miss Taylor began discussing the significance of perspective in literature, she noticed something shift in the room. A few students who had been whispering now leaned forward, engaged. Others who had looked skeptical began taking notes. But not everyone was won over. In the corner, a group of students exchanged looks and passed notes, occasionally glancing at her with barely concealed smirks. Miss Taylor recognized the challenge ahead. This wouldn't be an easy year. But as she guided the class through their first discussion, her voice steady and her mind sharp, she knew one thing for certain: she was exactly where she needed to be. The period ended with a buzz of conversation as students packed up their things. Some lingered curious about the homework assignment, while others rushed out, still processing the unexpected presence of their new teacher. Miss Taylor stayed at her desk, making notes about each student's participation. She could feel the weight of the year ahead, but she also felt something else: hope, because in those 45 minutes, she'd seen not just the doubt and prejudice she'd expected, but also glimpses of genuine interest, of minds starting to open. As she prepared for her next class, Miss Taylor remembered her own high school days, when she'd never seen a teacher who looked like her, let alone one who faced similar challenges. Sometimes, she thought, the biggest lessons happen outside the curriculum. She straightened her papers, ready to face whatever came next with determination and grace. 2 weeks into the semester, the whispers had grown louder. Students no longer tried to hide their skepticism about Miss Taylor's ability to teach. The back row of her advanced English class had become a hub of subtle resistance, led by 2 popular seniors who seemed determined to make every day a challenge. "Can you speak up?" called out Alex, a tall boy with an athletic build, his voice dripping with fake concern. "It's hard to hear you from back here." His friends snickered, knowing full well Miss Taylor's voice was perfectly clear. Miss Taylor adjusted her posture in her wheelchair, maintaining her composure. "Thank you for letting me know, Alex. Why don't you move to the front row? There's an empty seat right here." The class went quiet, waiting for his response. Alex shifted uncomfortably, caught in his own game. "No thanks. I'm good here," he mumbled. During group discussions, some students would deliberately speak in whispers, forcing Miss Taylor to wheel closer just to hear their conversations. Others would place their backpacks in the aisles, creating obstacles for her wheelchair. It was never anything big enough to report, but the small acts of defiance added up. One morning, Miss Taylor arrived to find her teacher's edition textbook placed on the highest shelf of the classroom bookcase. She knew it hadn't been there when she left the previous afternoon. Looking at the sea of innocent faces before her, she couldn't prove who had done it. "Miss," called out Rachel, Alex's girlfriend, with a sweet smile that didn't reach her eyes, "do you need help getting your book? It must be so hard not being able to reach things." The class watched, waiting to see how their teacher would react. Miss Taylor wheeled to her desk, pulled out her personal copy of the book from her bag, and began the lesson without missing a beat. "Today, we're discussing how authors use adversity to develop character. Would anyone like to start?" The small acts of rebellion continued. Students would accidentally drop papers just out of her reach. They'd rearrange the desks slightly, making the paths between them just a bit too narrow. During presentations, they'd stand in ways that forced her to crane her neck uncomfortably to see them. But Miss Taylor noticed something else too. Not all students participated in these acts. Some, like May from the front row, would quietly fix the desk arrangements before class. Others would pick up dropped papers without being asked, or share their textbooks with classmates to avoid the high shelf issue. One particularly difficult day, after Alex and his friends had spent the entire period making exaggerated wheelchair motions behind her back, Miss Taylor stayed late grading papers. The school halls were quiet when she heard a knock on her door. "Come in," she called, expecting the janitor. Instead, she saw Kim, one of the quieter students from her class. "I'm sorry," Kim said softly, looking at the floor. "I see what they're doing. It's not right." Miss Taylor put down her red pen. "Thank you, Kim. But why are you telling me this now?" Kim hesitated. "My cousin uses a wheelchair. When I told her about our class, she asked me if I was standing up for what's right. And I realized I wasn't. I was just watching it happen." That conversation marked a subtle shift. The next day, when Alex made another snide comment about Miss Taylor's special accommodations, Kim spoke up. "Why does it bother you so much? She's just trying to teach us." The class fell silent. Nobody had directly confronted the behavior before. Alex opened his mouth, then closed it, unsure how to respond to this unexpected challenge. Miss Taylor continued teaching, pretending not to notice the exchange. But she did notice how Kim's small act of defiance created ripples. A few more students began meeting her eyes, participating more actively in discussions. Some even stayed after class to ask genuine questions about the literature they were studying. The resistance wasn't over. Alex and his friends still found ways to make things difficult. But something had shifted. The class was no longer united in this subtle rebellion. Some students had begun to see beyond the wheelchair, beyond the color of her skin, to the teacher who was genuinely trying to help them learn. As Miss Taylor packed up her materials that afternoon, she thought about Kim's words. Sometimes change didn't come from grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it came from quiet moments of courage, from simple words spoken at the right time. The semester was far from over, and there would be more challenges ahead. But for the first time, Miss Taylor felt like she was making progress, not just in teaching literature, but in teaching something far more important. The morning of the big presentation dawned cold and gray. Miss Taylor had spent weeks preparing her students for their analysis of contemporary literature, and today they would present their findings to the department head and several other teachers. She arrived early, as always, pulling into her reserved parking spot, while the morning folks still hugged the ground. The security guard waved as she made her way to the building, her breath visible in the chilly air. Everything seemed normal until she reached her classroom door. The moment she opened it, her heart sank. The room was completely different from how she'd left it the previous afternoon. All the desks had been pushed together into tight clusters, creating a maze of narrow pathways that her wheelchair couldn't possibly navigate. The presentation podium had been moved to a raised platform someone had brought in from the auditorium. Even her teacher's desk had been shifted, blocking access to the computer station she needed for the presentations. No, she whispered, checking her watch. The first bell would ring in 20 minutes, and the presentations were scheduled to begin in less than an hour. She tried to move one of the desk clusters, but they were too heavy to shift from her seated position. As she surveyed the damage, she heard snickering from the hallway. Through the door's window, she caught a glimpse of Alex and his friends quickly walking away. One of them was holding up a phone, obviously recording her reaction. Miss Taylor took a deep breath, fighting back tears of frustration. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of breaking down. Instead, she pulled out her phone to call the janitor for help, but the call went straight to voicemail. Students began arriving, their reactions ranging from shocked gasps to poorly concealed smirks. The department head would be here soon, along with other teachers and administrators, to evaluate the presentations she'd worked so hard to prepare her students for. What happened here? Kim asked as she walked in, genuine concern in her voice. Before Miss Taylor could respond, someone's phone buzzed loudly, then another and another. She could see students pulling out their phones, watching something with wide eyes. Her heart raced as she realized what must be happening. The video of her discovering the classroom was already circulating. Miss Taylor. A soft voice came from the doorway. It was May, the quiet student from the front row. Behind her stood David from the basketball team and Lee from the art club. We want to help. Without waiting for a response, they moved into action. David and Lee began shifting the desk clusters back to their original positions, while May and Kim cleared paths and adjusted the computer station. Other students trickled in, and seeing their classmates at work, joined in. Alex and his friends arrived just as the room was nearly back to normal, their triumphant grins fading at the sight of their handiwork being undone. They stood awkwardly in the doorway, phones still in hand. The presentation platform needs to go back to the auditorium, Miss Taylor said calmly, looking directly at Alex. Since you know where it came from, would you please return it? The hallway had grown quiet. Other teachers and students had stopped to watch. Alex's face reddened as he felt the weight of their stares. Yeah, whatever, he mumbled, gesturing to his friends to help him with the platform. Just then, the department head arrived, raising her eyebrows at the scene before her. Is everything all right, Miss Taylor? Yes, Miss Taylor replied, her voice steady. We just had a slight furniture rearrangement, but my students helped solve the problem. In fact, I think it's a perfect lead-in to today's presentations about overcoming obstacles in literature. The presentations began on time. One by one, students stood to share their analyses of various literary works. When it was Alex's turn, he stumbled through his presentation, unable to meet Miss Taylor's eyes. The video that had seemed so funny earlier now felt like evidence of something he wasn't proud of. During lunch break, Miss Taylor found a note on her desk. It was from Alex. I'm sorry. What we did wasn't funny. It was mean. Can we talk after school? She put the note in her drawer, thinking about how sometimes the hardest lessons weren't found in any textbook. As she watched her students return to class for the afternoon session, she noticed something had shifted. The barriers that had been built weren't just physical, and maybe, just maybe, they were finally starting to come down. The day ended with an unexpected announcement over the school's speaker system. Attention students and staff. Any sharing or forwarding of this morning's video will result in immediate disciplinary action. Additionally, tomorrow's assembly will address our school's policies on respect and accessibility. Miss Taylor wheeled herself out of the classroom that evening, tired but hopeful. Sometimes it took hitting rock bottom to start climbing back up. And tomorrow would be another day to try again, to teach not just English, but empathy, understanding, and the kind of lessons that lasted long after the school bell rang. The day after the classroom incident, Miss Taylor noticed May lingering after class. She'd always been a quiet student, sitting in the front row, taking detailed notes, but rarely speaking up. Today, something was different about her demeanor. Can I help you with something, May? Miss Taylor asked, organizing papers on her desk while the last few students filtered out. May clutched her backpack straps tightly, gathering courage. Actually, I wanted to help you. She pulled out a chair and sat down, her usual shyness giving way to determination. What they did yesterday wasn't right, and I've been too quiet for too long. Miss Taylor set down her papers, giving May her full attention. What do you mean? My little brother, Danny, May's voice softened. He uses a wheelchair too. He's in middle school, and every day I worry about how people treat him. She pulled out her phone, showing Miss Taylor a photo of a smiling boy sitting in a wheelchair, holding up a science fair trophy. He looks like quite the achiever. Miss Taylor smiled, noting the pride in May's voice. He is, but he's worried about high school. He keeps asking me what it's like, if people will accept him. May's eyes welled up with tears. When I saw what happened in class yesterday, I kept thinking, what if that happens to Danny? What if no one stands up for him? Miss Taylor wheeled around her desk to sit beside May. It's not easy being different in high school, is it? No, May wiped her eyes. But watching you, you never let it stop you. You just keep teaching, keep trying to reach us, even when some students are really mean. Danny needs to see that. Everyone needs to see that. What are you suggesting? Miss Taylor asked, sensing May had more to say. May straightened up, her voice growing stronger. I want to start a club. Not just about disabilities, but about understanding different perspectives. Maybe if people understood more, they'd act differently. Just then, there was a knock at the door. To their surprise, Alex stood there, looking uncomfortable but determined. Sorry to interrupt, he said, shuffling his feet. But I heard what you were saying about the club. Could I help? Miss Taylor and May exchanged surprised looks. Alex, who had been one of the ringleaders in yesterday's incident, wanting to help. I did a lot of thinking last night, Alex continued, moving into the room. My uncle just got diagnosed with MS. He might need a wheelchair soon. Yesterday, when I was helping mess up the classroom, I thought it was funny. But then I imagined someone doing that to my uncle. He trailed off, clearly struggling with his emotions. Take a seat, Alex, Miss Taylor said gently, gesturing to another chair. For the next hour, the three of them talked. May shared stories about Danny's challenges and triumphs. Alex opened up about his uncle's diagnosis and his own fears about the future. Miss Taylor listened, occasionally sharing her own experiences, but mostly letting the students lead the conversation. We could call it the Bridge Club, May suggested excitedly, because we're trying to build bridges between different groups of people. And maybe we could do like accessibility checks around school. Alex added, warming to the idea. I never realized how many places are hard to get to until yesterday. Miss Taylor watched as these two students, who had never interacted much before, began planning and brainstorming together. May's quiet determination complemented Alex's newfound enthusiasm. They talked about weekly meetings, awareness campaigns, and ways to make the school more inclusive. We could even visit middle schools, May said, show kids like my brother that high school doesn't have to be scary, and maybe help teachers understand too, Alex added, looking apologetically at Miss Taylor. Some of them probably don't know what to do when they have students with different needs. As the afternoon light slanted through the classroom windows, Miss Taylor felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the sunshine. This was why she became a teacher, not just to teach literature, but to witness moments like this, when students discovered their own capacity for growth and change. I have one condition, she said, as May and Alex were wrapping up their planning. This club needs to be student-led. I'll be your advisor, but the ideas and leadership need to come from you. They both nodded eagerly. As they left the classroom, Miss Taylor heard them still discussing plans, their voices animated with purpose. She looked at the spot where just yesterday, desks had been piled to block her path. Now in that same space, something new was growing: understanding, empathy, and hope. That evening, as she prepared to leave school, Miss Taylor received an email. It was from the principal, responding to her request to start a new student club. Absolutely approved, it read. Sometimes the best teaching happens outside the classroom. She smiled, thinking of May's brother Danny, of Alex's uncle, of all the students who might find their lives changed by what had started here today. Sometimes the worst moments could lead to the best beginnings. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but now she knew she wasn't facing them alone. The classroom buzzed with nervous energy as Miss Taylor wheeled to the front, carrying a stack of colorful folders. The Bridge Club had been meeting for 2 weeks now, and she'd noticed subtle changes in how students interacted with each other. It was time to take the next step. Today, she announced, we're starting a special project. She began distributing the folders. Each of you will research an author who faced significant challenges in their life, but still created remarkable work. Opening the folders, students found lists of writers they'd never heard of before. There were poets who wrote despite losing their sight, novelists who typed with mouthsticks, and authors who fought against both disability and racial prejudice. "Miss," called out Peter, frowning at his folder, "I got some lady who wrote from a hospital bed. How could she write anything good if she was sick all the time?" "Excellent question," Miss Taylor smiled. "Why don't you research her and find out? Sometimes the most powerful stories come from the most unexpected places." Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the classroom shifted. Students who usually rushed out at the bell now stayed behind, deep in research. The library became crowded with advanced English students, all hunting for information about their assigned authors. Kim sat at her desk, completely absorbed in a biography. "Did you know this writer taught herself to read while hiding from slave catchers? She asked anyone who would listen, and she went on to write 12 books." Even Rachel, who had once been quick to mock Miss Taylor, found herself drawn into the project. Her assigned author had written award-winning novels while battling multiple sclerosis. "It's kind of amazing," she admitted during class discussion. She couldn't hold a pen some days, but she didn't give up. The project took an unexpected turn when Alex raised his hand during a research session. "Miss Taylor, I found something interesting about my author." He walked to the front of the class, tablet in hand. "He wrote this really famous book series that my little sister loves. I had no idea he was in a wheelchair." Miss Taylor watched as other students gathered around Alex's tablet, their faces showing surprise and interest. "That's the thing about challenges," she said. "They don't define what someone can achieve." One afternoon, May stayed after class, clutching a book to her chest. "I showed my brother Danny some of these stories," she said. "He got really excited. He wants to be a writer now." The presentations began the following week. One by one, students shared what they'd learned. But they weren't just reciting facts, they were making connections. "My author didn't just write books," Lee explained during his presentation. "She created a whole new way for blind people to read. It made me think about how many other things we could change if we just looked at problems differently." Peter, who had initially complained about his assignment, stood nervously at the front of the class. "So this writer I thought wouldn't be interesting. She wrote 3 bestsellers from her hospital bed. And get this, she used to say that being stuck in bed gave her time to imagine bigger stories." He paused, looking directly at Miss Taylor. "I guess sometimes what we think of as limitations aren't really limitations at all." The project's impact spread beyond the classroom. Students began talking about their authors in the cafeteria, sharing interesting facts they'd discovered. The school newspaper ran a feature on hidden heroes of literature inspired by the class presentations. During one memorable presentation, Tim, a usually quiet student, revealed something personal. "My author had dyslexia, just like me," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "Everyone told him he couldn't be a writer because he couldn't spell well. But he proved them wrong. Maybe," he glanced around the room, gaining confidence, "maybe we all have stories that need to be told." Miss Taylor noticed other changes too. Students began automatically making space in the aisles for her wheelchair. When new books arrived for the class, they were placed on accessible shelves without anyone having to ask. Small changes, but meaningful ones. The project culminated in a special evening event where students shared their research with parents and other teachers. The school library was transformed with displays about different authors, their struggles, and their triumphs. "I never knew there were so many amazing writers who'd faced challenges like this," one parent commented, examining a display about a deaf poet. "It really makes you think about what's possible." As Miss Taylor watched her students proudly presenting their work, she remembered her own struggles as a student, never seeing teachers or authors who looked like her or faced similar challenges. Now, her students were discovering that greatness could come in many forms. The evening ended with an announcement from the principal. Inspired by the project, the school would be starting a creative writing program focused on diverse voices and experiences, and they wanted Miss Taylor to lead it. Sometimes, she thought, watching her students chatting excitedly about their discoveries, the best lessons aren't found in textbooks at all. They're found in the stories we choose to tell and in the voices we choose to hear. The afternoon sun streamed through the classroom windows as Alex stood at the front, clutching his presentation notes. His hands were shaking slightly, something his classmates had never seen before. The confident troublemaker who had once led the charge in making Miss Taylor's life difficult now looked nervous and vulnerable. "My presentation is about Thomas Reid," he began, his voice unusually quiet. "He wrote the Mountain Mysteries series." Alex paused, taking a deep breath. "I'd actually picked him because those books were my dad's favorites." The class sat up straighter, sensing something different in Alex's tone. Even Miss Taylor wheeled closer, noticing the emotion in his voice. What I didn't know was... Alex swallowed hard. Reid wrote all those books while fighting multiple sclerosis. He could barely hold a pen some days, but he kept writing. He said that every obstacle was just another story waiting to be told. Alex clicked to the next slide, showing a photo of Reid in his wheelchair. 3 days ago, my dad had an accident at his construction site. The doctors, his voice cracked slightly, they say he might not walk again. The classroom went completely silent. Rachel, who had been Alex's partner in mischief, reached out and squeezed his hand. Miss Taylor noticed several students wiping their eyes. When I found out about my dad, I remembered all the terrible things we did in this class. Alex looked directly at Miss Taylor. The desks, the high shelves, the video. I kept thinking about how my dad might face those same challenges. And I felt so ashamed. He clicked to another slide showing Reid's writing setup, a specially designed desk with voice recognition software. Reid didn't let his disability stop him. He found new ways to tell his stories. And you, Miss Taylor, he turned to face her, you never let our stupid pranks stop you from teaching us. You just kept finding new ways to reach us. Miss Taylor nodded encouragingly, her own eyes glistening with tears. Yesterday, I visited my dad in the hospital, Alex continued. I brought him Reid's latest book. When I told him about this project, about how Reid writes despite his MS, I saw something change in my dad's eyes. It was like he could see a future again. The next slide showed a quote from Reid. Our limitations are just invitations to find new paths forward. My dad asked me to read the book to him. Alex's voice grew stronger. It was the first time he'd smiled since the accident, and while I was reading, I realized something. All those times we were making fun of Miss Taylor, we weren't just being mean to her. We were making fun of everyone who faces challenges. We were making fun of people like Reid, like my dad. He paused, gathering his thoughts. But the really amazing thing is what Miss Taylor did. Instead of getting angry or giving up on us, she gave us this project. She made us look deeper, see things differently. And now, he smiled slightly, now my dad has a hero to look up to. Someone who shows him that life doesn't end when things get hard. The bell rang, but nobody moved. Alex had one more slide to show. It was a photo of him and his dad in the hospital, both holding copies of Reid's book. My dad wanted me to share something with the class, Alex said. He said, tell them that sometimes our worst moments can lead us to our best selves. As Alex returned to his seat, the classroom erupted in applause. Students who had once joined in mocking Miss Taylor now approached her desk, offering quiet apologies. Others shared stories about their own family members who had faced similar challenges. Miss Taylor watched as her students gathered around Alex, offering support and sharing their own connections to the stories they'd researched. She saw Rachel hugging him, tears streaming down her face. Even the usually reserved Tim patted Alex's shoulder, sharing how his own cousin had recovered from a serious accident. Later that afternoon, as the students filed out, Alex lingered behind. Miss Taylor, he said softly, would you maybe visit my dad sometime? I think he'd like to meet you. Miss Taylor smiled warmly. I'd be honored, she replied. And Alex? Thank you for sharing your story. It takes courage to be this honest. As she watched him leave, Miss Taylor thought about how transformation rarely happens in grand gestures. Instead, it comes in quiet moments of understanding, in the sudden recognition of our shared humanity. Alex's presentation hadn't just changed him, it had touched something deep in everyone who heard it. She looked at the quote still displayed on the screen. Our limitations are just invitations to find new paths forward. Sometimes, she realized, the best teaching moments came not from lesson plans, but from the heart. The morning of graduation arrived with perfect blue skies and a gentle breeze. The school grounds buzzed with excitement as seniors in their caps and gowns gathered, taking photos and sharing last-minute hugs. but something special was happening behind the scenes. In the school auditorium, Alex and the Bridge Club members were putting final touches on a surprise they'd been planning for weeks. May adjusted a banner while others arranged photographs on display boards, images showing the journey of their class throughout the year. "Is everything ready?" Miss Taylor asked as she wheeled into the auditorium. Her eyes widened at the transformation. The stage had been modified with a newly installed ramp decorated with flowers and ribbons. "Almost," Alex grinned, adjusting his graduation cap. "Did you see who made it?" Through the entrance, Alex's father wheeled himself in, looking stronger than he had in the hospital months ago. He was wearing a suit and tie, clearly dressed for the occasion. Behind him, May's brother Danny beamed with excitement, his wheelchair sporting a future graduate sign. The whole recovery group from the hospital wanted to come, Alex's dad explained, his eyes bright. "Your story, our story. It spread further than you know, Miss Taylor." The graduation ceremony began with traditional speeches, but then the principal made an unexpected announcement. "This year's graduation will be a bit different," she said, smiling. "The senior class has prepared something special." The lights dimmed and a video began playing on the large screen. It showed clips from throughout the year, but not the usual graduation highlights. Instead, it showed the transformation of room 237, Miss Taylor's classroom. There was the early footage of students rearranging desks to block her path, but it didn't stop there. It continued to show how those same students later worked to make the school more accessible. The video showed the Bridge Club's first meeting, students helping install lower water fountains, and Alex reading to his father in the hospital. Kim's voice narrated, "We thought we were just getting an English teacher. Instead, we got a lesson in humanity." The video shifted to show academic achievements, the highest AP English scores in school history displayed on screen. Then came clips of the author research projects, students passionately presenting their findings, and the evening event that had drawn hundreds from the community. Me appeared on screen next. Miss Taylor taught us that our differences aren't limitations, they're opportunities to learn from each other. The audience watched as the video showed Danny visiting the high school, meeting other students, his fear transforming into hope. It showed Alex's father joining a support group, then starting to mentor other newly injured patients. Alex's voice took over. "Sometimes the best teachers don't just teach subjects, they teach us how to be better people." When the lights came back on, there wasn't a dry eye in the auditorium. But the surprises weren't over. The senior class president stepped up to the microphone. "This year, our class raised funds for what we're calling the Bridge Scholarship," she announced. "Each year, it will help students with disabilities pursue their dreams of higher education." Miss Taylor covered her mouth in surprise as the first recipient was announced, Danny, May's brother, who would be starting high school next year. The ceremony continued with the usual traditions, names called, diplomas handed out, caps thrown in the air. But there was something different about this graduation. Parents noticed it. Teachers commented on it. This class had changed, grown, learned something beyond textbooks and tests. At the reception afterward, students gathered around Miss Taylor, sharing memories and taking photos. Alex's father wheeled up beside her. "You know," he said quietly, "when I first got hurt, I thought my life was over. But watching how you handled everything, seeing how you inspired these kids, it showed me that life isn't about what you can't do. It's about what you choose to do with what you have." The Bridge Club members had one final surprise. They presented Miss Taylor with a book, a collection of letters from students, parents, and community members whose lives had been touched by the changes that had started in room 237. "Next year's gonna be different," May said, looking around at the younger students who had already signed up for the Bridge Club. "Because of you, nobody will have to face those challenges alone." As the sun set on the graduation ceremony, Miss Taylor sat in her classroom one last time before summer break. The walls were covered with student projects, the desks arranged in perfect, accessible rows. On her desk sat the book of letters, and beside it, a photo of her first class. A group of students who had started as her biggest challenge and ended as her greatest triumph. She opened the book to find one last note, written by Alex. "You taught us that the biggest disabilities aren't physical, they're the limitations we put on our hearts and minds. Thank you for helping us break free from those." Miss Taylor smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring new students, new challenges, and new opportunities to bridge the gaps between people. Sometimes the greatest victories weren't in changing the world, but in changing one heart at a time.